Las tinieblas y el alba. Lo fácil sería decir que este es el acontecimiento editorial del año, pero es que no es solo eso, es también un acontecimiento para los millones de lectores de Ken Follett que tenemos ya la suerte de tener este libro en nuestras manos. Este libro que está lleno de vida, este libro que está lleno de aventuras y este libro que está lleno de momentos de placer que se pasan en sus páginas. La verdad es que un escritor es alguien que se hace preguntas. Allá por finales de los años 80, Ken Follett se preguntó por qué se construían las catedrales y de aquella pregunta nació Kingsbridge y nació también los pilares de la Tierra. Mucho tiempo después, Ken Follett se preguntó cómo sería Kingsbridge antes de tener esa catedral y antes de ser esa ciudad que todos conocimos en los pilares de la Tierra. Y la respuesta está en las tinieblas y el alba, porque Kingsbridge era apenas un pueblo perdido que ni siquiera se llamaba Kingsbridge porque ni siquiera tenía puente, que se llamaba Dren's Ferry, y es el lugar en el que sucede todo lo que sucede en este libro que hoy estamos presentando aquí. Y además, bueno, pues tenemos la suerte y el privilegio de poder hablar de todo ello con Ken Follett, que está en su casa. Es una pena que tengamos que hacerlo por videoconferencia porque sabemos que al señor Follett le encanta venir a España a presentar sus libros. Tiene aquí muchos y muy buenos lectores. Señor Follett, Las tinieblas y el alba es una historia de personajes que luchan por avanzar, que luchan por el progreso, que luchan por ver ese futuro y por ver cómo ese pequeño lugar Dren's Ferry se puede convertir en otra cosa, ¿no?
Part of the story is about how this little village grew into a great city. And I thought that would make a good story because whenever there is progress like this, there are some people who say, yes, we want progress, we must have a marketplace, we must have a cathedral, we must have a bridge. And then there are people who say, no, let's keep everything the way it is. We like it. No changes, no new people. And this is the kind of conflict that readers in the 21st century will immediately understand, even though it's a conflict in the Dark Ages. And I just thought that would be, it's not the whole story. I thought it would make a very good part of the story.
Después hablaremos de esos personajes y de cómo entran en conflictos, pero lo primero que tenemos que hacer es darle la enhorabuena. Los lectores españoles adoramos a Ken Follett y su libro, que lleva muy poco tiempo en las librerías, se ha convertido ya en el número 1 en las listas de ventas. Pero yo creo que quien mejor nos va a contar esto es Nuria Cabutí, CEO de Penguin Random House. Nuria, felicidades a vosotros también por este número 1.
Gracias. Bueno, Ken, bienvenido y la verdad es que es un placer verte. Estoy muy contenta de que podamos reunirnos, aunque sea online. Y primero de todo lo que quiero es felicitarte por tu gran nuevo éxito, un éxito que salió el 15 de septiembre a las librerías y que ya es número 1 en España y en todos los países de América Latina y que estamos convencidos que va a seducir a muchísimos lectores de todo el mundo. Y claro, es que es la precuela de Pilares de la Tierra, tu libro más vendido con más de 42 millones de ejemplares y que todos adoran, adoramos y que continuamos también leyendo. Yo, Ken, en esta ocasión quería preguntarte cómo han sido estos meses de confinamiento, dónde has estado y en qué has estado ocupando tu tiempo.
My working day is the same as always. I sit in this chair, in this library, with a keyboard in front of me, and I write all day. And that's what I've been doing for the last 45 years. So in the daytime, the virus makes no difference to me. But of course, in the evening, it's completely different. There is no social life. I can't go to the theater. All my friends in Spain know that what I love most is to have dinner in a restaurant and talk to my friends while the waiters bring bottles of wine and plates of food. I think it's the greatest thing human beings have ever invented. And of course, I can't do that now. And the serious the thing that makes me seriously sad is a lot of my family live in the United States, and of course I haven't seen them for a long time, and that's very sad. And so I hope we will have a vaccine soon, and I can just have an injection and go and see my family.
Sí, todos lo esperamos y esperemos que sea pronto, pronto para todos. Yo creo que una de las ventajas de hoy es que tenemos precisamente la oportunidad de estar en el estudio de Ken Follett. Yo personalmente estuve ahí una vez y la verdad es que lo recuerdo con muchísima curiosidad, porque Ken vive en una casa muy bonita en las afueras de Londres y tiene su estudio, que es un lugar con varias pantallas, a veces parece casi un estudio de un ingeniero, varias pantallas trabajando y también muchísima documentación, muchísimos libros. Y yo creo que hoy nos has abierto tu estudio, que es un sitio también muy íntimo, ¿no? Entonces, ¿estás haciendo todas las promociones desde aquí, desde este sitio tan personal, Ken?
Yes, I do all my interviews sitting here. In fact, I'm doing a global book tour, but instead of going to airports and catching planes, I'm sitting here and talking to people on social media. And actually, you know, it works quite well. I've done lots of interviews, and it's quite an enjoyable way to talk to people. It's very intimate, and you don't have to you don't have to stay in hotels and fly and all that. So really, this works pretty well for me from the point of view of publicity. This room is where I spend more time in this room than anywhere else in the world. And so you're right, I have made it comfortable and how I like. As I have books, I have guitars, I have lots of pictures and photos of my family, and but I could stay here for years.
Claro, y nosotros, por otro lado, echaremos de menos tu visita a España, porque yo de todos los libros que tú has publicado, todos ellos con gran éxito, siempre has venido a España para promocionar tus libros y para tener contacto físico con estos lectores, ¿no? Con estos fans que quieren hablar contigo, que tú les firmes un libro. Entonces, decirte que vamos a echarte mucho de menos. ¿Y cómo piensas que van a sentirse, ¿no? Esos lectores? ¿Cómo tú también sientes que no tienes este contacto físico con ellos esta vez, sin poderles dedicar un libro?
Well, that part of it is, you're quite right, that is completely different. Of course, I do online events in which I talk to hundreds of readers, thousands of readers at the same time, but I can't see them. They can see me, but I can't see them. And you're right, Nuria, that makes a big difference. So if I say something that I think is funny, I don't know whether anybody's laughing. And, you know, I always, when I'm speaking to a big audience, I always listen, because I figure if they're quiet, then I'm doing okay. If they're making a noise and talking to one another, then I must be boring. So I always listen to the audience to figure out if they're enjoying the talk. And of course, I can't do that now. So you're absolutely right. It's with an audience, these in-person talks are completely different. And although I do them all the time now on Zoom, you're right, it's not the same.
Bueno, Ken, yo quiero agradecerte tu disponibilidad, felicitarte de nuevo y te dejo con tus lectores, que son los que quieren oír lo que nos puedes contar hoy de tu nuevo libro tan interesante. Felicidades y espero verte pronto físicamente en Inglaterra o en España o donde sea. Un abrazo muy fuerte, Ken.
I hope we will meet before too long.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Nuria Cabuti. Vamos a ver si luego podemos hacer un poquito de nuestra magia para que el señor Follett reciba las preguntas de los lectores y además pueda verlos, ya que dice que en esos otros actos virtuales recibe las preguntas pero no tiene ese contacto. Vamos a ver qué poquito de magia podemos hacer después. Hemos hablado de el éxito que tiene siempre Ken Follett en España con este libro Las tinieblas y el alba, es ya número 1 en ventas. Pero yo no sé, señor Follett, si a usted le gustaría ver cómo suena este libro en español. Si le parece, vamos a ver un pequeño vídeo de la grabación del audiolibro con el actor Jordi Boixaderas.
Edgar había descubierto que era muy difícil permanecer en vela durante toda una noche, aunque fuese la noche más importante de su vida. Había extendido su capa sobre la estera de juncos del suelo, y en ese momento yacía tumbado sobre ella, vestido con la túnica de lana de color pardo que le llegaba hasta las rodillas y que era lo único que llevaba en verano día y noche. En invierno se arrebujaba con la capa y se acostaba junto al fuego, pero en esas fechas hacía calor. Apenas quedaba una semana para el solsticio de verano, el día de San Juan.
It sounds better in Spanish.
Suena muy bien también en el inglés, pero suena magníficamente bien en la voz de Jordi Boixaderas. Este es el inicio de la novela de Las tinieblas y el alba. Estamos en el año 997. Edgar es el pilar fundamental de este libro, es uno de los 3 protagonistas fundamentales. Y claro, estamos en una época, lo decía el señor Follett antes, es la Edad Oscura, es una época de la que conocemos muy poco y de la que también hay muy poca documentación. Pero como siempre, Ken Follett nos hace un retrato absolutamente vívido y visual y nos traslada a esa época. Yo diría que Ken Follett es un tejedor de historias y creo que lo de tejedor es bastante apropiado aquí porque usted, además, una de las fuentes que tuvo para tejer esta historia maravillosa en la Edad Oscura de todos esos personajes fue precisamente un tapiz, el tapiz de Bayeux.
The best source of information about everyday life in the 11th century is the Bayeux Tapestry. It's like a strip cartoon. It's very long, 60 meters long, and it's embroidered on linen, colored wool embroidered on linen, and it tells the story of the Norman conquest of England, but along the way, it kind of accidentally tells us a lot about everyday life in the 11th century. For example, we see people having lunch, and we see people with their dogs and their birds, people on horseback. Horses were very important at the time. People chopping down trees, and of course, men in battle. And this tapestry is now in a museum in Bayeux. It's survived 1,000 years, amazingly. And there's a copy in a museum in England. And of course, you can buy little copies. And all the time I was writing, the evening and the morning, I had on my desk this copy of the Bayeux Tapestry. So you can see the little pictures of the people on their boats, and you can see them chopping down trees in this picture. And this was a tremendous resource for me. It was very helpful to me in writing the evening and the morning.
Bueno, yo estuve viendo el tapiz de Bayeux y yo no vi detalles que Ken Follett sí que ha visto y que nos muestra en este libro. Por ejemplo, cuenta en el libro que los anglosajones llevaban bigote, mientras que los normandos llevaban barba, además de otros detalles que cuentan como cómo embarcaban en los barcos. Usted siempre tiene esta atención por el detalle, por hacer que la novela sea muy visual, por hacer que los lectores estemos inmersos en toda esta historia. Pero claro, en este caso, como bien dice, era mucho más complicado por la falta de documentación.
It's true, they didn't write much down. The Anglo-Saxons were not very good at reading and writing. They didn't leave very many stone buildings. That's a problem. You know, the Romans, we know a lot about Roman buildings. Many of them are still standing or ruins are still standing. But the Anglo-Saxons built their houses of wood and straw. And of course, that doesn't last. So there's very little from the Anglo-Saxons. The Vikings left us something. The Vikings had the best ships in the world, very fast, very beautiful. And there's a museum in Oslo called the Viking Ship Museum. And as you walk into this museum, you see one of these marvelous ships kind of rearing up in front of you, very graceful, very menacing. And when I saw this, of course, I thought of the first scene in the book. I thought of somebody standing on the shore and looking out to sea at dawn and seeing 12 or 15 of these ships coming across the water towards him. And of course, he knows that hell is coming.
Miren, Ken Follett, ustedes lo saben, vosotros lo sabéis, es un narrador tan sorprendente que no voy a destripar nada, pero en las 20 primeras páginas de este libro, de Las tinieblas y el alba, tenemos un joven que va a huir de su casa, que de repente ve acercarse ese barco del que estaba hablando Ken Follett, que a él tanto le impresionó cuando fue al Museo de las Naves Vikingas de Oslo, que ve cómo llegan los vikingos, que... Pero no voy a contar nada más, pero en 20 páginas su vida cambia, le da una vuelta tremenda, porque Ken Follett, si algo hace siempre, es llevarnos a los lectores de la mano, porque lo importante, señor Follett, es siempre la historia y que los lectores queramos seguir con esa historia, ¿no?
Well, I think that's really the only thing that matters, that the readers want to carry on with the story. You know, I'm a reader too. And what I love is having a book that gives me that feeling that I don't want to stop reading, where I just want to, and I say, it's getting late, but I will just read a few more pages, just a few more pages. And of course, that's what I love as a reader, and that's what I'm trying to give my readers. So I hope that readers will read the first scene about Edgar and his plans, and how really all his plans have to change because of what happens that night. And I hope that readers will say, oh my goodness, now what's he going to do?
¿Qué va a pasar ahora y qué es lo que va a hacer Edgar? Les aseguro que eso es lo que pasa. Cuando uno se mete en las tinieblas y el alba, no puede salir de allí, no puede dejar de pasar páginas. Si hay alguien que se preocupa mucho, además, por cómo se hace esto, es un escritor español. Él es escritor de bestsellers. Además conoció a Ken Follett cuando Ken Follett estuvo en España la última vez en el Friendship Tour. Es nuestro amigo Javier Castillo. Él escribe thriller. Es un gran constructor, además de tramas, para que también le sigamos. Y hoy queríamos que Javier estuviera con nosotros para saludar a Ken Follett. Javier Castillo, muchas gracias por acompañarnos.
Muchas gracias, Marta. Hi, Mr. Follett. Nice to see you again.
Hello, Javier. How are you? It's good to see you again.
How are you?
How's the writing
la verdad
going?
es que estoy muy feliz y emocionado por estar este ratito y tener la oportunidad de nuevo de charlar contigo. Y la verdad es que me planteaba un poco como qué preguntarte, y siendo escritor, yo creo que lo que más me inquieta y me ilusiona es cómo nacen las historias, ¿no? Y cómo una novela como esta nace. En este caso, al ser la precuela de Los pilares de la Tierra, que para ti es una novela también muy importante, yo creo que es la novela que se ha convertido como insignia de la humanidad, yo creo que me interesa muchísimo saber cómo nace ese primer párrafo y cómo te sentiste al escribir ese primer párrafo en el que Edgar ya sienta las bases de lo que va a ser y lo que va a conseguir.
The very beginning of the evening and the morning has a young man in a dark room. This is because I have to show the reader the world that he lives in, but I have to show it bit by bit. otherwise it's too confusing. So at first, he's lying in the room, it's almost dark, and by the firelight, he can see his family and the rest of the room. So now we know this bit of his world. Then he goes outside. Now we can see what's outside the house. Then he goes across the bay and he can see the town. So this is how, and at each of these stages, he also thinks about people. So just very slowly, the reader is drawn into this quite strange world of the 11th century. And at the same time, we know that something very dramatic is happening in this young man's life. And we hope, and already we quite like him because he seems like a nice boy. And so already we hope that this is going to go well for him. So now we have the two things we need in the first scene. We have the introduction to this imaginary world, and we're already invested in this character. We're already hoping it will go well, and we're already a little afraid that maybe it won't go well. And so if I've written it well, then the reader will be captured right at the start.
Sí, no, la verdad es que lo has conseguido realmente bien, porque ya estoy completamente enganchado a la historia. Y una segunda pregunta que me guardaba era, yo también escribo con la intención de capturar y atrapar en las tramas, y llega un punto en cuanto a la amplitud que se complica todo y que parece todo mucho más complejo. Y más, a mí me parece ya de maestría conseguirlo en más de 1000 páginas. ¿Cómo te estructuras el proceso para atrapar y mantener esa tensión narrativa continua para que constantemente estemos preocupados por Edgar o queriendo saber si consigue lo que se propone?
Well, you're right that long books are complicated, but they must never seem complicated to the reader. I know it's complicated, and you're a writer, so you know it's complicated, and it can be difficult to keep track of everything for me, but for the reader, it must seem very easy, because nobody reads my books nobody wants my books to be difficult. Of course, there are some writers who are difficult, and we think of Marcel Proust as the great writer who is also very difficult. I'm not doing that. I want it to be easy. How do we keep the reader's interest? For me, this is achieved by planning the story. I spend a long time planning the story, a year usually. And that is so that I can make sure that every few pages, something new happens. The story turns. It might be a big change or a little change. It might be a big thing like a murder, but it might be a little thing like somebody telling a lie. But even that, you see, that's drama. Somebody tells a lie and the reader thinks, oh, will people know that he's lying? Will he be found out? It's embarrassing, isn't it, when you tell a lie and people know that you've told a lie? Oh, my God. So even a little drama like that, but there must always be a new drama every few pages so that the reader is always thinking, now what will happen?
Nada, muchísimas gracias, Mr. Follett. Te deseo toda la suerte del mundo, aunque ya sabemos que no la necesitas. Y ojalá esto de la pandemia y del COVID acabe pronto y nos veamos de nuevo en persona.
Pues ese es el deseo que tenemos todos. Muchísimas gracias, Javier, por haber estado aquí con nosotros. Gracias. Claro, hablaban Javier, Castillo y Ken Follett de cómo el lector consigue involucrarse con esa historia, pero yo como lectora creo que también nos involucramos no solo por la historia, que es absolutamente fascinante, que como explicaba Ken Follett te va llevando de un sitio a otro, va cambiando, sino también por la identificación con los personajes. Y claro, es llamativo que uno pueda llegar a identificarse con un personaje alrededor del año 997, pero Ken Follett lo ha hecho en otras ocasiones y lo hace ahora, y lo hace apelando a eso que todos tenemos en común, ¿no? Despertando una reacción emocional en el lector que se ve reflejado en un personaje de hace 1000 años que en el fondo siente lo mismo, anhela lo mismo y sufre las mismas injusticias que nosotros, ¿no?
Yes, I believe that people haven't changed very much since the year 1000. Of course, our lives are completely different from the lives of the people in the 11th century. But the fundamental things that we worry about are the same. Like us, the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings and the Normans worry about love and marriage and family and work and money and war and violence. These are the basic things that everybody worries about. And I believe that 1,000 years ago, they worried about the same things. So I write about those kind of problems, very fundamental problems. And part of the pleasure in a historical novel is seeing how those familiar problems play out in a completely different period of history, completely different landscape, completely different customs and laws and weapons and clothes and all that sort of thing. But that's the decoration. The heart of the story is those very fundamental hopes and fears that we all have.
Y eso está en los personajes de Las tinieblas y el alba. Pero ya que hablamos de otro periodo histórico, vamos a darle paso a otro escritor que también se dedica a la novela histórica. Él es especialista en Leonardo da Vinci y en el Renacimiento. Yo creo que ya todos los que nos están viendo saben que estamos hablando de Cristian Gálvez. Cristian, pues aquí tenemos a Ken Follett para que le preguntes lo que quieras.
It's a pleasure, Mr. Follett, to be with you. Marta, estás espectacular, como siempre. Enhorabuena, compañera.
Gracias.
Bueno, Mr. Follett, como amante de la historia, de la literatura y de la buena construcción de los personajes, muchísimas gracias por este cara a cara con gente que le admiramos. Mi interés principal reside en todos esos personajes históricos que, a pesar de su genialidad, al ser señalados por otros, bueno, se sintieron en algún momento de su vida fracasados. Por poner un par de ejemplos, Marta lo mencionaba, el propio Leonardo da Vinci o incluso, si nos vamos a Inglaterra, Charles Chaplin, ¿no? En este caso, Mr. Follett, sus personajes triunfan, pero sus personajes también fracasan. Para el Ken Follett autor, pero también para el Ken Follett persona, ¿qué es el fracaso y qué podemos aprender de él?
Well, I think we all decide what is success and failure for ourselves. And there are some very competitive people for whom success is something very high, very unattainable. For example, if you're a football player, soccer player, you want to play for the national team and you want to win the World Cup. You're not satisfied just scoring a goal on Saturday morning in the park if you're a professional football player. So athletes of all kinds are an example of people who set the bar very high. And there are many people whose aspirations are much more modest, but they're just as happy. If all you want to do is, let's say, become head of the accounts department, and you become head of the accounts department, you're just as happy as the football player who's playing for the national team. Now, I'm one of the people who set the target very high. I wanted to be a world bestseller. I didn't just want to be an okay writer with quite a lot of readers. I wanted the whole thing. And so for me, that was success, and anything less would have been failure. And it, of course, is a very foolish thing to think that you can become a world best-selling author. Why would I think that I could do that? But I did. So that was success for me. Now, failure for me now would be to publish a book and for readers to say, it's all right, but it's not as good as his last book. That's my nightmare. That's what I'm frightened of. And I think about it all the time when I'm writing, sitting here, and I look at what I've written and I say, how will the readers feel about this page? Will they say, oh my goodness, and turn the page quickly? Or will they say, I don't know if I'm going to finish this book? We all think that sometimes with books, don't we? We all read books and halfway through we think, this is a bit dull. I don't know if I'm going to finish this. And that's my nightmare, that I should write a book like that. And readers who have loved my stories for many years will say, oh, this one's not very good. So that's failure for me.
Sí, entonces el éxito y el fracaso depende de las expectativas, Mr. Follett. Por favor, no deje nunca de tener las expectativas tan altas. Enhorabuena.
Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Cristian. Esta pesadilla que tiene Ken Follett se la puede quitar de la cabeza. Hablábamos de esos personajes y hablaba con Cristian de cómo esos personajes a veces también fracasan, pero claro, es que esos personajes luchan por conceptos y por ideas muy potentes y de mucho peso. Me da la sensación de que los personajes de Ken Follett y también en Las tinieblas y el alba, y no solo Edgar, sino también los otros personajes, Aldred y Ragna, siempre luchan por la libertad y por la justicia. Pero claro, eso en el año 1000 es muchísimo más complicado.
Well, certainly they had different notions of freedom and justice, but at this point, round about the year 1000, people were beginning to think about justice, and they were beginning to imagine a better system of justice. We have, in most countries now in Western Europe, North America, we have what we call the rule of law, which means that the law stands above the government. The president and the king and everybody is subject to the law. Nobody is above the law. The law stands above the government. It's called the rule of law. 1,000 years ago, they didn't have this, but they were beginning to think about it. And so there are several characters in the evening and the morning who go to the court to demand justice. And they generally don't get it, but they aspire to it. And you're quite right. That's the kind of theme that I like. People fighting for something, and we can all identify with their desire for justice and freedom. I've written about other kinds of freedom. My last book, A Column of Fire, was about the struggle for religious freedom, the right to go to whatever church you want, not the church that the king tells you to go to. And I've written about the suffragettes. We're fighting for women's rights, and about African Americans fighting for civil rights. And I like those stories because the people are struggling. Of course, they're struggling for themselves, but they're also struggling for something that isn't just about themselves. It's about making a better world. And I think as readers, we enjoy that. We identify with them. We want them to win their struggle, of course, because we like them. But we also want them to achieve what they're hoping for to make a better world.
Claro, porque además nos gusta ponerle cara, historia a esas personas que han construido un mundo mejor. En este caso, además, nos gusta ponerle cara e historias a esos personajes que estaban en Kingsbridge antes de estar en Kingsbridge, porque para muchos lectores Los pilares de la Tierra fue una puerta abierta a todo el universo de la lectura. Creo que de eso sabe mucho nuestra siguiente invitada. Ella es Paola Boutellier, ella es booktuber. Fíjense que tiene 175.000 seguidores en YouTube, así que Paola sabe mucho de cómo abrir las puertas a los lectores y cómo hacerles entrar en este maravilloso mundo del libro y en este caso en Las tinieblas y el alba. Paola, Está aquí Ken Follett, veo que tienes ahí el libro en tu biblioteca, sé que te lo has leído y que lo has disfrutado.
Buenas, Marta. Sí, hi, Mr. Follett. It's a pleasure to be
Hi.
here with you. Bueno, la verdad es que es un placer de verdad porque recuerdo de pequeñita siempre lo primero que recuerdo es a mi madre con el libro de los pilares de la Tierra en su mesita de noche. Así que sí, es totalmente un placer. La saga de los pilares de la Tierra, y preveo también que su precuela, no solo ha enganchado al público adulto, sino también por experiencia propia, ya digo que al más joven. Sé que los jóvenes son unos ávidos lectores, leen muchísimo, pero también le cuesta engancharles a este género porque son muy exigentes, yo os lo digo. Aún así, la saga de los pilares de la Tierra ha conseguido enganchar a esos lectores jóvenes y entonces mi pregunta para el señor Follett es ¿por qué cree que ha sido así? ¿Por qué cree que esta saga ha enganchado a todos los lectores, no solo a los adultos, sino también a los más jóvenes? ¿Y por qué? Y bueno, si pensó en llegar a todas estas edades cuando decidió embarcarse en su novela, tanto en esta como en las anteriores.
I don't think specially about young readers, but I suppose there's always at least one young man or woman, or generally both, a young man and a young woman, who are still finding their way in life. And I do that actually not to attract young readers, but I do it because it's interesting from a literary point of view. A character who hasn't yet made up her mind about what she wants in life, or a young man who hasn't made up his mind about what kind of work he wants to do. This is a good drama, and I suppose it's also interesting to young people who feel themselves in the same situation, that they haven't made up their minds yet. And I remember this very vividly in my own life, and I'm sure everybody does. It's not just me. But thinking about the future and thinking, will I be successful? And will I find true love? And will I be rich or poor? Will I be sent to jail or killed in a war? You think when you're 20 years old, you think any of these things could happen to you, and it's true, they could all happen to you. But the main thing is, I think, if people are going to enjoy a book, it shouldn't be difficult to read. It should be easy to read. And I try to write very clear sentences. I don't want anybody who is reading one of my books to have to read something twice to figure out what I was getting at. I want it to be understood immediately. And I do think that young people are impatient with difficult and slow moving books. They want to get on with the story. But I think the absolute model of a writer who knows how to appeal to young people is J.K. Rowling in the Harry Potter books. That I was so impressed with the way she got young people to queue up outside the bookstore. When they were publishing those Harry Potter books, my grandchildren were getting up at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning to queue outside the bookstore to get the first copy of the new Harry Potter book. And I'm talking about kids who normally didn't get up before midday on a Saturday. So it was a terrific achievement, I think. You've got to give kids the right stories. If you ask them, look, I loved, for example, Charles Dickens. Let's take a Spanish example. Don Quixote is a very important book. It's the first novel ever written. You shouldn't give that to young people to read. It's boring. Young people need exciting stories. Then when they're 70, let them read Don Quixote. They'll be ready for it then. But when they're young, give them something that makes them say, this is great.
Estoy totalmente de acuerdo con usted, Mr. Follett. Necesitamos drama, acción. Todo eso lo tiene su novela, así que enhorabuena, muchísimas gracias y espero que le veamos pronto por aquí, por España.
I hope so.
Muchas gracias, Paola, muchísimas gracias. La verdad es que este libro, Las tinieblas y el alba, será una puerta de entrada para muchos jóvenes lectores que no conozcan todavía a Ken Follett. Para aquellos que leyeron la trilogía de los pilares de la Tierra, en este libro hay eso que llamamos huevos de Pascua, muchos pequeños huevos de Pascua que uno puede ir identificando si ha leído los libros posteriores. Yo quería preguntarle a Ken Follett, no quiero parecer demasiado codiciosa, pero el libro va del año 997 al año 1007. Hay un siglo entre esto y el inicio de los pilares de la Tierra. No sé si en algún momento ha pensado escribir más sobre cómo Denks Ferry se convierte en Kingsbridge. La precuela 2.
Well, I don't have any plans to do that. But you know the saying, never say never. And I didn't have any, after The Pillars of the Earth, I didn't have any plans to write any more books about Kingsbridge. And look, now I've written 4 books altogether about Kingsbridge. So I don't know what's going to happen. And for me, the important thing is whether I think of something that would be a really wonderful story. And that's really the only thing that matters. If I think of a wonderful story set in Kingsbridge, I'll do it. And if it's a wonderful story, but it's set in the Roman Empire or the 19th century, I'll do it. It's, for me, it's that what counts more than anything else is that the story is strong.
Bueno, y para nosotros como lectores también. Estoy segura que ella, que es periodista, que es escritora y que sabe ver dónde hay una buena historia, estará de acuerdo con Ken Follett. Hablo de Luz Sánchez-Mellado, es nuestra siguiente invitada. Fíjate, Luz, que hace un momento estábamos hablando de lo presentes, de lo actuales que parecen los personajes de Ken Follett, que son los personajes de Ken Follett, que tienen nuestras mismas preocupaciones y tienen nuestros mismos problemas. Pero es que en este libro, que sucede en el año 1000, hay mucho que podemos reconocer de lo actual, ¿no?
Pues sí, yo quería saludar a Mr. Follett. Hi, Mr. Follett. Usted no se acuerda de mí, pero yo sí me acuerdo de usted. Coincidimos en Segovia, en el High Festival. Yo iba bastante intimidada por la presencia de, bueno, pues uno de los grandes bestsellers mundiales y bueno, no solamente quedamos amigos, sino que incluso tuvo la deferencia usted de colgar una foto en Twitter con nuestro encuentro. Esa foto preside mi dormitorio y probablemente forme parte de, bueno, pues mi responso cuando me llegue la hora. ¿Le puedo llamar colega, Mr. Follett? Porque usted y yo somos colegas. Usted fue periodista, empezó como tal y empezó narrando la actualidad. ¿Tan harto quedó de actualidad como para remontarse 1000 años atrás a ambientar sus historias?
Our current times, of course, really are not boring. In fact, I wish they were more boring than they are. But the trouble with writing stories about current problems is that the story hasn't ended yet. So I couldn't write a novel about COVID-19 because we don't know how it's going to end. And a good story must have a good ending. Doesn't have to be a happy ending, although myself, I really like happy endings, but it must have a resolution. And right now there's no resolution about COVID. There's no resolution about the rise in Europe of the new fascism. It's still happening. We don't know how it will end. And so for me, that's not, those aren't really, I can't imagine writing a novel about those subjects, although of course, some of those conflicts and some of those problems find echoes in history. And I don't write these stories to teach people lessons, because I can't teach people lessons. I'm not cleverer than my readers. My readers are very clever people, and they don't want me to tell them what to think. They want me to show them a different world. And so in the 11th century, there are some things happening which resonate with modern problems. And clearly, slavery is one of those. In England in the 11th century, slavery was legal. It wasn't against the law. Tragically, we still have slavery here in England, but at least it is now against the law. At least it's a crime now. 1,000 years ago, it wasn't even a crime. And so I felt it was very important to write about that, because 10% of the population of England were slaves 1,000 years ago. 10%. It's an enormous number. And so that had to be an important aspect of the story of The Evening and the Morning.
Se me ha quedado algo en el tintero, y es no solamente el tema de pues la esclavitud, hablando de temas actuales y no solamente sentimientos actuales. Sus mujeres son siempre mujeres fuertes, mujeres que se buscan la vida, que tiran para adelante. Son mujeres de armas tomar. ¿Considera la revolución de las mujeres en finales del siglo XX, principios del XXI, con los últimos acontecimientos? Una cosa es que usted escriba sobre el pasado, en el pasado, pero le inspira ese movimiento femenino que ha cambiado las estructuras de las relaciones entre sexos en este siglo.
Yes, clearly this movement has inspired my work. I was a teenager in the 60s, and I remember the beginning of what's sometimes called the second wave of feminism, because I was at university in the late 60s, and the women who were saying, we must be treated equally, this is unjust, these were the women we liked. These were the women we wanted to date. We wanted to kiss them and maybe marry them. We adored these women. And when they said this, we listened. And I remember, it's a funny thing, it's a little thing, but I remember we were all very political at university in London in the late 60s. And we believed in democracy. Everything had to be very democratic. And I remember someone saying, if we're all equal, why is it always the girls that make the tea? And it was a funny thing to say, but it was true. And I remember thinking, my God, why is it the girls that make the tea? We assumed there would be a political meeting, all democratic, voting on everything, but we would tell the girls to make the tea. And that was when I realized something was wrong. Now, and then, of course, many things followed from that. And then in the 70s, when I was writing Eye of the Needle, my first thought was that this would be a story about two men on an island, and one of them has to kill the other. And then I thought, wouldn't it be more interesting if it's a man and a woman, and one of them has to kill the other? And of course, it was much more interesting. That thought made it a much better book. And of course, and it made it a more modern story. I think I was the first writer to make a woman the hero of a traditional thriller, a shoot-bang traditional thriller. But after that, there were lots of others. And there are now at least half the thrillers in the bestseller list now have women as heroes. But in the 1970s, it was pretty unusual. And since then, I've always had strong women in my books. And look, there are strong women in my life. In fact, I can't think of any of the women in my life who aren't strong women, come to think of it. So, this is normal. This is the normal thing. I was quite interested to see that my father could never accept this. And I think it was just because when the second wave of feminism began in the 60s, my dad was too old to change. But I was a teenager, and you can change when you're a teenager, can't you? New things come along and you say, yes, that's right, I believe in that. And so it wasn't difficult for me. It was too difficult for my dad, but it was easy for me, and and it now seems completely natural. I mean, I wouldn't dream of writing a book that was all about men. I actually find women much more interesting than men anyway, so I would never write a book that was all about men.
Muchísimas gracias, Mr. Follett. Le esperamos el próximo 8 de marzo, Día de la Mujer en Madrid, si el virus nos lo permite.
Muchas gracias, Luz.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Hemos recibido una sí. Queremos tener a Ken Follett aquí lo antes posible. Yo estoy segura de que quien quiere tenerle aquí lo antes posible, aunque ya le tiene en forma de libro, es Diego Ochoa. Diego Ochoa es librero, es coordinador de la cadena de librerías Santos Ochoa. Es una cadena con más de un siglo de antigüedad y que está presente con 11 tiendas en 7 comunidades autónomas. Diego, lo que yo no sé es cómo te quedan libros todavía ahí en el escaparate, porque como decimos aquí en España, señor Follett, te los quitan de las manos.
Pues aquí estamos. Hemos tenido que guardar unos poquitos libros para que por lo menos se pudiesen ver. Hi, Mr. Follett. Nice to meet you. La verdad que estamos muy contentos. Cada lanzamiento de un libro tuyo es para nosotros como una fiesta. Y así intentamos, los clientes vienen entusiasmados. Entonces, pues la verdad que ¿qué más podemos pedir? Bueno, realmente también sabemos que te encanta viajar por España y que siempre que viajas te encanta ver librerías. Entonces, bueno, pues que sepas que por un lado aquí en La Rioja estaríamos encantadísimos de verte. Y mi pregunta es la siguiente. ¿Qué papel han jugado las librerías y los libreros a lo largo de tu vida?
Oh, well. Ever since I was 4 years old, reading has been one of the great pleasures of my life. And of course, there is nothing like spending time in a bookshop, just walking around. Everything that human beings have ever learned or invented is in books. And when we walk into a bookstore, the whole of human history and human civilization is in front of us. And it's like a table of food. You can have anything. You can have a detective story or a science fiction story or a history book or a poetry book. All of this is spread out in front of you. And I walk into a bookstore and I think, I'm so lucky to be alive at this point in the 21st century when I can have all of this and really not too expensive.
La verdad que desde luego todo lo que comentas es cierto y gracias a autores como tú es como podemos tener las librerías así, con tantísima vida y con tantísimos libros buenos. Así que muchísimas gracias y confiemos en que sea el bestseller del número 1 en España, que estoy plenamente seguro de que así va a ser. Muchísimas gracias y sigue escribiendo así de bien.
And thank you for selling so well.
Muchas gracias. Claro, damos tantas cosas por sentadas, pero en Las tinieblas y en Alba, por ejemplo, hay un personaje, Aldred, para el que los libros son un verdadero tesoro. Claro, imagínense en aquella época lo que era conseguir un libro religioso para un monasterio, ¿no? Fíjese, Ken Follett, todo el mundo estamos diciéndole queremos que venga a España, porque es la primera vez que falta, por razones evidentes, a su cita con los lectores españoles. Pero nosotros hemos querido pues recordar algunos de aquellos momentos que para nosotros siempre han sido muy felices, han sido siempre grandes fiestas, las salidas de los libros de Ken Follett. Voy a enseñarle algunas fotos, a ver a qué le recuerdan. Porque mire, por ejemplo, cuando la gente va a Vitoria, sobre todo cuando los británicos van a Vitoria, se encuentran sorprendidísimos de encontrarse allí con Ken Follett. ¿Recuerda usted el de aquella foto, no?
I certainly do. It was quite wonderful. It's the only time anybody has ever put up a statue of me, and there I am, right outside the cathedral, like a saint. Now, Now, I must say, my friends think that the idea of me being a saint is pretty funny, actually. But I'm very proud.
Bueno, la verdad es que es una escultura maravillosa, además. Tenemos más fotos. Esta es de la presentación de una columna de fuego, donde Ken Follett forma parte de un cuadro viviente. La verdad es que al señor Follett le gusta España, sabemos que le gusta venir aquí, sabemos que le gusta venir a documentarse in situ, que ha estado, por ejemplo, muchas veces en Sevilla documentándose, pero también le gusta tener contacto con los lectores. Esto fue la presentación de una columna de fuego y la verdad que también fue toda una fiesta, señor Follett.
I certainly do. It was kind of amazing. All these actors came on stage dressed as characters from my book, A Column of Fire, and then I stood with them in my 21st century suit.
Bueno, y esta es una foto del invierno del mundo, ¿no? Donde, bueno, pues allí aparece con estos republicanos.
Yes, of course I do. Yes, and I was quite fat then, wasn't I? Gosh.
Estas también de un invierno. Sí, estas también del invierno del mundo.
Yeah, and the same
Bueno,
color.
Estamos deseando que el señor Follett venga a España, pero claro, yo quería preguntarle algo a Ken Follett, que ahora está en su estudio, en el que nos ha permitido que nos colemos hoy en ese Santa Santorum del escritor, pero nos decía que, claro, está en su casa, evidentemente por razón del COVID-19, del coronavirus, y sabemos que a Ken Follett, para documentarse, incluso para pensar en las tramas de sus novelas, le gusta mucho viajar a los sitios. Supongo que esto también estará echándolo de menos, ¿no? Poder ir a visitar sitios, poder ir a documentarse in situ, poder venir a España por si quiere escribir algo más en lo que aparezca en nuestro país.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, the picture you're looking at now is the cathedral in Seville, I think.
Sí.
And that kind of thing appeals to me enormously. I love to. Everybody knows that I love cathedrals, and I'll go anywhere to look at a new cathedral. And yes, you know, how long can this go on? Here we are, all of us stuck in our houses, and it's very dangerous to go out. It's dangerous to go to airports. It's dangerous to fly. It's dangerous to go to restaurants and bars. And I'm really in a hurry to get back to normal life.
Bueno, la verdad es que nosotros los lectores lo que tenemos la suerte es que con libros como este sí que podemos viajar no solo en el tiempo, sino también a ese otro espacio que, como decía, queda tan absolutamente bien dibujado en todos sus detalles, no solo los visuales. Cuando uno se mete en este libro, huele cómo era la época, siente el frío de la época. He de decir que hasta dan ganas de beber cerveza leyendo el libro, porque hay bastante y buena cerveza de la época. Uno se sumerge en todo eso.
Yes,
Como...
beer was an important drink in the
Sí.
At this period. In fact, it wasn't actually beer; it was ale, which is slightly different. It's not so strong, but they did have a strong drink called mead, which is an alcoholic drink made from honey. And apparently, because it's very sweet, people drink a lot of it, but it's also very strong. So they all become falling down drunk. The Anglo-Saxons apparently were terrible drunks, and come to think of it, they still are.
Bueno, pues en este libro en el que, como decía, uno pasa a vivir en el año 1000, se han sumergido ya muchos lectores españoles. Nosotros hemos hecho un concurso, ¿sabéis?, en el que os hemos pedido que nos mandarais vuestras preguntas para Ken Follett, porque queríamos que existiera este contacto. Hemos recibido muchísimas, pero vamos a hacer ahora una ronda rápida, señor Follett, en el que le voy a pasar con las preguntas de los lectores. La primera en preguntar es Samantha, desde México.
¿Qué tal? Yo soy Samantha, soy de México y mi pregunta es ¿cuál es la parte que más disfrutas de la investigación, en este caso para entender la construcción de un bote vikingo?
I did enjoy going to the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo because it was very inspirational. Just the look of those ships, how beautiful they were, how graceful, how menacing, how dangerous they looked, inspired me. And you'll see in the evening and the morning how throughout the novel, although the Vikings aren't always on the scene, as it were, they are always lurking in the background. Everybody's afraid of them all the time. Even when they don't come and raid, people are afraid that they're going to come. And so that sense of menace from the Vikings, which is all through the novel, owes a lot of inspiration to that particular museum. I like to go and look at things. It's true. I mean, you can find out a great deal about the Anglo-Saxon period from books. You know, there are books about what they ate and books about what they wore, books about their weapons, books about their houses. But to go and look at things is really much more inspiring for the author, and that's what I like to do best.
Me interesa mucho que va a contestar Ken Follett a la pregunta que nos hace Karen desde Chile.
Hola, soy Karen de Chile y mi pregunta para Ken es si viviera en Kingsbridge, ¿qué rol cumpliría dentro de la ciudad y por qué?
Karen, this is difficult for me because they didn't really need a novelist in Kingsbridge. In fact, in the Middle Ages, nobody needed a novelist. And if I think about the other things that you could do in Kingsbridge, I couldn't be a monk. I have to be honest with you, Karen, and say that I am really too fond of the company of women to be a monk. I would hate it. I couldn't be a soldier. You can't see this on the screen, but I'm not a very big guy. I've never been a fighting type. I would be a terrible soldier. And I couldn't be a farmer. When I was a boy, my father gave me a little bit of the garden to cultivate, and nothing ever grew there. Nothing. Nothing I put in the ground ever grew. So I don't know what I would do in Kingsbridge. I suppose the only thing I can do other than writing is music. So maybe I could have played the organ in the church. I might have been okay at that. My family is very musical, but I'm not the best of them. But maybe I could have just about made it as a musician in the church. But I couldn't be a priest for the reason mentioned beforehand. So if I was in Kingsbridge, I'd be in trouble.
Bueno, la próxima vez que venga a España a lo mejor debemos conseguir un órgano para Ken Follett, un buen órgano de iglesia. Vamos a ver qué nos pregunta Andrés desde España.
Mi pregunta es, ¿qué obra fue la más complicada de escribir? ¿Los pilares de la Tierra, alguna de las secuelas o la precuela que se acaba de publicar? Gracias.
The Pillars of the Earth was very difficult for me to write. I had never tried anything like that before. I had never written a book that long, and you know, it's about 3 or 4 times as long as a normal novel. And the thing is, with a novel like a thriller, you write 100,000 words and it's finished. But with a book like The Pillars of the Earth, you write 100,000 words and you've hardly got started. And you have to keep on making up more and more story about the same people. And of course, this is much more difficult for the author, but it's much more satisfying for the reader because you go deep into their lives, the lives of the characters. A regular novel is like a photograph of the characters at some point in their life. And, you know, it maybe covers a few weeks or months, maybe a year or two. But in a book like The Pillars of the Earth, you see their whole life and you become very intimate with them. And so the experience is much more profound and much deeper. But it's very much more difficult to do. And I felt, when I finished The Pillars of the Earth, I felt exhausted. It took me 3 years and 3 months. And for the last year, I was working Saturdays and Sundays as well, because it was just taking me too long. And so it was really very difficult. And nothing, I got to tell you, Andres, nothing I've done since has been anywhere near that difficult.
Bueno, pues ya por último, desde Argentina, esta es la pregunta de Sergio.
Hola, mi nombre es Sergio de Córdoba, Argentina, y me gustaría preguntarle a Ken qué personaje o qué personajes de su libro le gustaría conocer en la vida real y por qué.
Well, Sergio, there is a character in The Evening and the Morning called Ragnar. And she is a rather beautiful and smart and determined Norman princess. And she has a lot of bad luck in this story. Some bad things happen to her, but she never gives in. She keeps on fighting back. And I'd really like to meet her. I think she would be so interesting. She'd be so much fun. She'd be so sexy. And I could be friends with Ragnar. Yeah, I would like to have Ragnar as a friend.
A mí me encantaría también poder ser amiga de Ragnar. Señor Follett, había muchos más lectores que nos querían mandar más preguntas. Tenemos todavía la esperanza de que esto pase, pueda venir a España y podamos tener un encuentro en algún momento de nuevo con usted en persona. La verdad es que ha sido un honor. Muchas gracias, Ken Follett, por este magnífico libro, Las tinieblas y el alba. Muchas gracias por habernos permitido viajar a esta época con estos personajes. Muchas gracias también a Isabela Ozores, que es la traductora habitual de Ken Follett en sus visitas a España. Gracias, esperamos verle pronto.
Thank you, Isabella. Thank you, Marta.
Bueno, ha sido un placer escuchar a Ken Follett. Vosotros, lectores, no os vayáis porque vamos a despedirnos con un pequeño documental, On the Trail of History, donde vemos a Ken Follett haciendo toda esa búsqueda, visitando el tapiz de Bayeux, visitando el Museo de las Naves Vikingas, es decir, los lugares de donde sacó la inspiración para Las tinieblas y el alba. Muchas gracias a todos.
The Evening and the Morning takes place around the year 1000. It's the end of the Dark Ages and the beginning of the Middle Ages. And what we're seeing is a conflict between people who want England to be ruled by law and people who prefer the old ways. So this is the point at which England begins to change, and the main drama of the story comes in conflict about that change. After The Pillars of the Earth, I wrote 2 books which took place in the same town, Kingsbridge, in later periods of history. The Evening and the Morning takes place in Kingsbridge at an earlier period of history. The richest source of information about this period of history is what we call the Bayeux Tapestry, which is a sort of enormous comic strip embroidered on linen showing the story of England and Normandy and how the Normans came to be the rulers of England. And the great thing about the Bayeux Tapestry is the details of everyday life. It's a time when horses were terribly important and a lot of people go places on horseback. So it's important to know what it was like. They didn't have docks. If you wanted to go aboard a ship, you hitched up the skirts of your tunic around your waist and you walked through the shallow water. And in my story, people go between England and Normandy quite a lot. So this depiction is helpful to me. If you want to do historical novels, you've got to get this stuff right. Now, architecture excites me because it tells of a way of life, you see. We're at Glastonbury Abbey. There has been a monastery here since the 1st century AD, and 2 of my characters visited at different times. Edgar wants to build a canal and he wants to see how they've done it. Alden comes here, he is a monk. He comes here to beg a gift. His little monastery is broke, and he thinks that if he can get the relics of a saint, it will attract pilgrims and they will make money out of the pilgrims. I won't tell you whether he gets it, you have to read the book. The Evening and the Morning certainly has some strong female characters, as my books always do. When we first meet Ragnar in France, she's already a young woman of importance. She rules over extensive lands, she acts as a judge, but she falls in love with an Anglo-Saxon chieftain, and she goes to England to marry him. She finds that England is relatively lawless and that her husband's family is violent and completely ruthless. But she doesn't just accept this. She cultivates her own allies, she builds her own power base, and she fights back. Hello.
Welcome.
Wow. One of my characters is a boat builder, Edgar, who is really the hero of the story. The best boats at the time were those of the Vikings. Happily, there is in Oslo a wonderful museum called the Viking Ship Museum. They have reconstructed the warships in which the Vikings came from Denmark and Norway to raid southern England. When they attacked towns and villages, they would steal anything valuable that they could carry away, like silver ornaments from the church. They also took the young men and women as slaves.
The worst thing you could see would be 5 or 6 of those damn Viking ships approaching up the river or approaching the beach of your town. Then you knew you were in for hell on earth.
In the opening of my story, the young hero, Edgar, is on the beach at dawn, and coming towards him, this is what he sees, with a dragon's head right at the front. And of course, it's a completely terrifying sight. So here is a dragon's head. Gosh, the carving is extraordinary, isn't it?
The look, the grandeur, and the grace of those ships is really a very important image for this book.
For the cover of The Evening and the Morning, for the first time, I've started working with an artist before the book is finished. And so I took Darren Cook, who is a designer who's worked on the covers of my books now for several years. And I took him with me to Oslo because I wanted him to see the helmets and the carving, because I knew that these things would inspire him.
When you see runic letter forms, they locate a piece in history so specifically. A lot of the characters are very similar to an M, a runic M is very similar to an M that we would use today. So there's a really good opportunity here to create a branded look for the title, which is inspired by the runic alphabet.
By the time the book is finished, we will have a very vivid idea of what the cover should look like all over the world. We're in the east of England, not far from the cathedral city of Lincoln. I was very pleased to find Dave Greenhalgh. He's an expert in ancient coins, and he's also a very practical guy, and he has a forge, and he actually makes replica coins in the way that they were made in Anglo-Saxon times. Part of the plot of The Evening and the Morning is that somebody's forging silver pennies, the only money in Anglo-Saxon England.
That can go in.
This is how you make the fire hotter.
And all this done with no electricity.
Yep.
They take a pound of silver penny, melt it down, mix it with a pound of copper, and make twice as many pennies as they had before. Double your money. Oof. If you just tried to imagine this, you would have no idea.
A novel is full of physical details of houses and churches and landscapes. All emotional stuff is based on physical description, and all physical description ought to have emotional weight. You've got to make it real in the reader's mind. You've got to make the reader have an emotional reaction to this story. It's a kind of enchantment. I'm in this book, and I really care more about what's going to happen in the next chapter of this book than what's going to happen to me tomorrow. That's a magic spell, and it's actually, in the end, it's the only thing that matters.